It happened when I was on my way home from the flea market across state lines. I sell things I make out of junk mostly. The term is trash sculptures in the community I belong to, but I never liked that term. Some may call this junk, but to me, they're treasures. I make all kinds of things, from stuff I find at the dump. People, vehicles, animals, whatever catches my eye. They sell pretty good, but not in my home state. I usually end up driving to Sadie's Flea Market, one of these huge, sprawling outdoor markets in Alabama, to sell my wares. The people there love them, and today was the first time in a while that I've come home with anything. I was loading the sitter into the back of my truck as the sun went down. I had made him out of rebar and old license plates. He was definitely unique looking. I had some lookers, but he was a little heavy for my usual crowd. The sitter was what you would call an end-of-the-day purchase, to be sure, and no one was buying him today. I sat him in the back of the truck and grinned as he sort of looked like he was just sitting there, just resting in the bed of the truck after a long day of being on display. With my passenger secured, I cleaned up my stall and rolled out of the parking lot just as it was starting to get dark. The road was busy, but not overly so. It's about an hour to my house through some pretty rural countryside. I never minded. It's a pretty soothing view as you roll along towards the Florida-Alabama line. Most of the route is roadside stands, abandoned buildings, gas stations, and the ever-popular fireworks stand. It's hard to explain, but it always seems so desolate out here. A single pole light shining beside the shell of an abandoned house, an old store that's slowly being retaken by the woods, a rotting cooler that someone had left by the roadside, its mouth wide open and its insides scummy. These were little things that reminded me that humanity had once had hope for these places that are out of the way, and it made me wish I had the skill to use a camera properly. Some artistic type would probably have paid a mint for pictures of some of these things. As I drove, I saw other people getting ready to leave. The sun was setting, and it washed them out in a way that's hard to explain. It's strange, but the setting sun always seems to gray these people a little, making them look like actors in an early 90s show. The sunset seems to bleed all the color out of them, and it's kind of nostalgic for me. It always seemed comfortable. At least, it did until today. As I drove for the state line, the sun turned the trees into a fiery corona, a forest fire that burned on and on until it was snuffed out with the eventual setting of the sun. It started rather subtly. I had chalked it up to the sun, having gone down when I first noticed it. But as I drove past a familiar barn, I had to double take. The barn was old, older than me probably, but it looked like something drawn in a sketchbook. It's hard to put into words, but it just looked flat and unfinished. As I watched, the light on the barn threw only a small circle of illumination, and the yard itself looked grainy and unreal. I watched as a cat scampered across the yard, and he looked like he might be made out of graphite, like graphite lines that had learned to walk and move all on their own. I rubbed at my eyes as I rolled along, pretty sure I was just getting tired. I had been making sculptures and putting together today's pieces all week, and I was probably just starting to feel the strain. A little sleep was all I needed, and once I got home, I could start burning my candle at both ends again tomorrow. The sitter would sit in my truck till I woke up tomorrow morning, and I'd have added another piece or two by next Saturday. I didn't think much of it as I rolled along until I saw the houses. The farther I drove, the harder it was to just ignore the strange changes in the landscape. I drove past a trailer park, and I could see all the gray lead outlines as the windows glowed. The insides looked like they were lit by bug zappers, that harsh fluorescent light making them seem to crackle. The spotlights made the concrete look porous, almost holy, and the dog resting out in front looked like if he were to bark, it would come out as a word bubble. It was all so very unreal, and I had to look down at my own hands in order to discover whether I too looked like a pencil sketch. I was pleased to find my normal level of realness, and just kept driving as I tried to get past whatever I had driven into. It didn't get bad until I came to the stoplight, though. There was only one stoplight before you got to the state line. It's probably there to allow people leaving the gas station or the liquor store to get back on the highway so they don't get creamed. The gas station had only a single light over the pump, but the inside looked welcoming. It reminded me of that painting, the one of the dead celebrities in the diner, and I was half tempted to turn in when something whooshed up to my left, and I turned to see a fire going on the side of the liquor store. It wasn't much more than a one-room building that sold beer and wine. I had driven past that pink stucco building 1,000 times, but it had an evil look to it tonight. It didn't glow like the trailers or the gas station did, and its face was dark and brooding as the glass reflected the fire on the side of it. At that moment, it seemed the antithesis of the gas station, and sitting across the street from each other, they almost seemed adversarial. The cars in the parking lot were the old rusty sort, pickups and dark-colored Cadillacs and long cigar-shaped constructions. They seemed to hunch around the lot like gargoyles, but as the fire began to build, I noticed the strange people that were feeding it. The store had a cage beside it, something the employees filled with cardboard boxes and trash and then burned when it got full. As I watched, the human-shaped creatures that seemed to be made of squiggly darkness were throwing boxes onto the fire and watching as they burned. The people weren't even approximations of people. They looked like a child's idea of human shapes, the bodies bulbous and the heads lumpy. Their arms were muscled and their legs disproportionately squat. They looked like orcs in the Lord of the Rings books, and just looking at them made me a little uneasy. They were supposed to be humans, but I had never seen anything less human in my life. They looked like natives in an old jungle picture, dancing around a flaming idol, and as I watched, I saw one of them take notice of me. I glanced back at the light, but it was hard to tell what color it was. All three were shades of gray, and as they flipped through, I couldn't tell what I was supposed to do. Something moved in front of that grainy flame then, drawing my attention back to the liquor store. The four of them froze as they saw that I had noticed them, their red eyes glaring as they prepared to run at my truck. Red or green, I no longer cared. I put my foot on the gas and blew through the intersection, rolling up the road as the four lumpy homunculuses watched me go. My tires squealed as they flew up the blacktop. The trees and the buildings we passed had begun to pulsate a little, their lead edges crackling like lightning. The whole thing looked like a Tex Avery cartoon, something from a sketchbook nightmare skit from an old show, and the longer I watched the sky, the less I cared about the road. My eyes were glued to that fuzzy space, the graphite lining sending phosphorescent clarity through the steely gray sky. Something was rising up amongst the clouds, a silver orb of a moon that suddenly and unexpectedly filled me with fear. Then it rolled in the sky, and I was suddenly looking at the eye of some great beast. It swam in that inky space, this perfect orb, and when it found me, I began to shake. The eye looked straight at me, fixing me with its gaze, not blinking as it regarded me, and that regard bore into me. I found myself unable to look away. When the harsh lights and the equally harsh horn invaded my space, I continued to be aware of nothing but that huge blinking moon. Then, suddenly, everything went black, and I was left floating in the inky blackness until the beeping brought me back to the waking world. I was in a hospital, arm aching from the IV and head pounding from the wound that had likely landed me there. My sister had been playing on her phone, but she looked up when I started groaning back to consciousness. She stopped me from getting up, and I realized that I only saw her out of the corner of one eye. Thankfully, the other was just covered in bandages, but at the time, it was pretty jarring. My sister filled me in and said she was glad I had come out because no one understood what had happened. According to the man in the moving truck, the one I had scared half to death, I had crossed into his lane as he was driving from the depot. He had swerved, barely avoiding the truck, and he said when I left the road something had fallen out of the back, and he had thought my passenger might have slid out. I had proceeded into the nearby woods before the tree had stopped my progress. It wasn't until he went to check on my passenger that he realized it was nothing but a dented metal doll, and went to check on me. He had helped me out of the truck and stayed with me till the ambulance came, and that was how I had ended up spending the next 4 days in a coma. I don't know what happened, and I can't really explain it, but somehow I slipped into something very different. The road I'd come to know was not what I had driven that night. and I suddenly found myself in a place that I couldn't come to terms with. I tried to tell people that, but they seemed to believe that I might have been drugged, or maybe I had picked up something I couldn't handle at the flea market. They never found anything heavier than Xanax in my system, though. My sister had floated the idea that I fell asleep and had a dream before I drove off the road, but I know what I saw. I saw those things, and I'm lucky to have escaped. So if you're driving the highways of America, be on the lookout for pockets of strangeness, and good luck to you if you happen to slip into one of them.
Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's video. If you enjoy the channel, why not go ahead and subscribe? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky stuff we do here. Maybe leave a comment too if you feel so inclined. Me, and of course the algorithm, always like when you interact. How about another video? I'm sure you could be down for that. Why not click on one of the videos above and get a little more spooky today? If you'd be interested in getting a copy of my latest book, there's a link below. There's also a link to my Reddit page where you can read some of my other stories that I've put out. Before we go, let's go ahead and thank our wonderful patrons. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. And thanks to Xaronana, Emily Coltsfoot, Leslie Lou Riddle, Martha, and Marianne Schuler for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks to you all. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the show, then I always recommend you come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can take advantage of all the wonderful things we do there. There's all kinds of unique content that you only get if you're part of my Patreon. So, come on down and see what all the fuss is about. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.